The door of the cabin swung open so hard it cracked against the outer wall, and Rebecca Pritchard stood in the frame with her single worn satchel hanging from one white-knuckled fist, the Montana wind tearing at the loose strands of her copper hair. Nathan Bailey stood 3 feet away from her inside that dim single room, his jaw set like carved granite, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not yet read, half fury, half something raw and unfinished that he had not decided to name. "It is too small," he said flatly. "One room, one cot, one stove. I told them plainly in that letter what the situation was, and they sent you anyway." Rebecca did not flinch. She had been sent across 2 territories by a matrimonial agency in St. Louis that had taken her last $4, and she had arrived on a horse-drawn mail coach that smelled of tobacco and old leather after 3 days of roads that were barely paths. She was 24 years old. She had survived things this man could not imagine, and she was not going to be undone by a man calling his own home inadequate. "I have slept in smaller," she said. The words landed in the cold air between them like a dropped coin, clear and final. Nathan stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them moved. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading. He had placed that advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette because his neighbor Frank Delacroix had told him he needed a woman who could help run the place through winter, and Nathan had convinced himself that was the only reason. He had not expected this particular woman with her squared-off chin and her quietly devastated eyes that somehow held no self-pity to walk into his doorway and refuse to be dismissed. "The cot fits one person," he said, trying again. "Then one of us sleeps on the floor," she said. "That would be me if you prefer, and I will not complain about it." Something shifted in Nathan's face. It was brief, almost invisible, a fracture in the stone. He stepped aside and let her through the door, and neither of them said another word about the size of the cabin that night. But he lay awake on his cot in the dark, listening to her quiet breathing on the floor beside him, and by the time the first gray light of dawn pushed through the single window, Nathan Bailey had already begun building the addition in his mind. That was October of 1882, in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, and the world outside that small cabin was still untamed enough to swallow a person whole if they let it. To understand how Rebecca Pritchard came to stand in that doorway with $4 spent and nothing left to lose, you had to go back to the spring of that same year, back to a town called Alderton in eastern Kansas, where she had been a schoolteacher for 2 years and believed, sincerely and completely, that her life was assembling itself into something decent. She had come to Alderton from Missouri after her mother's death, carrying a teaching certificate she had earned through a correspondence course and a recommendation letter from a minister who had known her family. Her father had died when she was 11, a dockworker's accident on the river at St. Joseph that left her mother alone with 3 children and a debt that never fully cleared. Rebecca had watched her mother work herself thin and silent for 13 years, and she had promised herself a different kind of life. Not grand, not gilded, just stable, just hers. Alderton had seemed like a beginning. The school was a single-room building at the edge of town, 14 children between the ages of 6 and 15, and a salary of $12 a month paid by the township. Rebecca had taken a room above the dry goods store, owned by a widow named Mrs. Acker, who was kind and sharp-tongued in equal measure, and who made good coffee and asked no intrusive questions, which Rebecca considered a perfect combination. For 2 years she had taught those children arithmetic and reading and a little geography, and she had been good at it. She had been genuinely, quietly happy at it. She had friends in town, a modest savings, and the beginning of a reputation as a person who could be counted on. Then the man named Silas Crane had arrived in Alderton. Silas was a land agent out of Wichita, broad-shouldered and clean-shaven in a way that suggested effort and expense, and he had ridden into town in the spring of 1882 with documents showing he represented a railway company interested in acquiring parcels along the proposed new line. He had been charming. He had been attentive. He had looked at Rebecca Pritchard in the specific way that a man looks at a woman when he has decided she is going to be useful to him, though she had not recognized it for what it was at the time. He had courted her quickly and openly, and with a confidence that she had mistaken for sincerity. He had told her he intended to settle in the territory once the land deal was finalized, that he was building toward something permanent, and that he wanted someone steady and intelligent beside him when he did. He had used the word love within 6 weeks, and she had believed him, because she had not been raised to expect the specific brand of deception he was practicing. What Silas Crane actually wanted was access to the deed records she kept in her position as a Township Education Board secretary, a secondary role she had taken on for an extra $2 a month. Those records showed land ownership maps and property boundaries that were relevant to the railway acquisition, and Silas needed to know which parcels had unclear title before the company made offers, so that he could acquire them cheaply under a separate name, and then sell them to the railway at a significant profit. He had used her. He had been warm and attentive and had kissed her on the porch of the dry goods store in the April moonlight, and he had used her. She had found out on a Tuesday in June when Mrs. Acker had shown her a notice in the Wichita paper, a report about a land fraud scheme involving a speculator named Silas Crane and several impersonated railway representatives. He had already left Alderton by then, 3 days earlier, with a quiet exit and no goodbye. The land board had held an inquiry. Rebecca had been questioned. She had not known, and there was no evidence that she had participated, and the inquiry had cleared her. But the town had watched her differently after that. Not with hostility, exactly, people were not unkind. But there was a particular quality of careful distance that settled around her that she recognized immediately, because she had seen her mother navigate it after her father's death. The way a community steps back from a person marked by misfortune, as though misfortune might be contagious. The school board had renewed her contract for the fall, technically, but the letter had been written in a tone that suggested they were doing her a favor, and when one of the board members had suggested in a public meeting that perhaps a fresh start might benefit everyone involved, she had understood that her time in Alderton was over. She had spent 3 weeks in a state of cold, private grief that she allowed no one to witness, and then she had gone to the post office and inquired about matrimonial agencies. Not because she was desperate for a man, but because she was desperate for a new geography. She needed to go somewhere her face was not known, somewhere her history had not preceded her, and a matrimonial placement in a distant territory seemed like the most logical vehicle available to a woman with limited funds and no family connections to call upon. The agency in St. Louis had matched her with 3 potential husbands, and she had exchanged letters with 2 of them. The first was a farmer in Nebraska, who had written 4 letters so tedious that she had felt her spirit actually dimming as she read them. The second was Nathan Bailey of the Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, who raised cattle and horses on 240 acres near a town called Millhaven, and who had written 1 letter that was terse to the point of rudeness, factually informative and completely without artifice. He had written, "I run a working cattle operation and need a partner in that enterprise, not an ornament. The work is real and the winters are hard, and I will not pretend otherwise. The cabin is a single room, which I mention because women have arrived here before expecting something they did not find and left immediately, which wastes everyone's time. If this is acceptable, you are welcome to come and see if we suit each other. If it is not acceptable, that is also fine. N. Bailey." She had read that letter 4 times. Then she had written back that she was not an ornament and had never wanted to be one, that she could work, and that she was coming. She had spent her last $4 on the agency placement fee and borrowed the coach fare from Mrs. Acker, who had pressed the money into her hands and said, "Go find yourself something real, girl," and Rebecca had climbed onto that coach and not looked back. The first morning in the Bitterroot Valley, Rebecca woke on the cabin floor before Nathan did, rolled her blanket, and went outside into the sharp October cold to find the well. She found it 20 yards from the cabin, drew water, and had coffee on the small cast-iron stove by the time Nathan's eyes opened. He sat up on the cot and looked at the cup she set on the table beside him with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating something. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I wanted coffee," she said. "There is enough for two." He drank it without further comment. She sat across from him on the single chair, and they assessed each other in the gray morning light with the particular directness of two people who have agreed to be honest with each other even before they have agreed on anything else. Nathan Bailey was 31 years old, which she had known from his letter. He was tall and spare, the kind of lean that came from hard physical work rather than deprivation, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were square and calloused and capable-looking. His face was not conventionally handsome, but it was interesting strong bones, a mouth that seemed accustomed to silence but not unkindness, those gray eyes that were direct without being aggressive. He looked like a man who had made a series of difficult decisions and was at peace with most of them. "I need to understand what you expect," he said. "And I need to understand the same," she replied. He told her about the operation plainly. The cattle herd numbered 62 head, winter range mostly though with some mountain pasture in summer. He had 3 horses, one of which was a reliable working animal, and 2 of which were young and still being broken. He had a contract with a beef buyer in Missoula that required a spring delivery, and the interim months were about keeping the herd healthy through Montana winter, which was not a trivial proposition. She told him about herself with the same plainness, editing nothing that was relevant. She told him she had been a school teacher in Kansas. She told him she had been involved with a man who turned out to be dishonest and that she had left the town afterward. She did not tell him the details of what Sila's crane had done, not yet, because some things required time and trust before they could be laid out fully, but she told him the shape of it. He listened without interrupting. "That does not concern me," he said when she finished. "Some people find it concerning," she said. "Some people are fools," he said, and went back to his coffee. She felt something unlock in her chest at that, small and careful, not yet ready to be named. The question of the matrimonial arrangement itself they addressed directly that same morning. He told her he had corresponded with the agency in good faith, but that he believed 2 people should know each other before they made a legal commitment of that nature, and that he did not expect her to feel obligated to anything immediately. She told him she agreed entirely. They established that she would stay through the winter on a trial basis, that she would work for her keep, and that he would pay her a small wage in addition, and that they would decide about the formal arrangement in the spring. It was a businesslike conversation, and it left both of them feeling oddly exposed, the way honest conversations sometimes do. By the end of the first week, Rebecca understood why Nathan had described the single room as a problem. It was not simply a matter of sleeping arrangements, though that was awkward enough. It was that there was nowhere to be alone. The cabin was perhaps 16 feet by 14 feet, with the cot against one wall and the stove and table occupying most of the remaining space. There was a single shelf of books above the table. She noticed this immediately, and it told her something about hem-end pegs on the wall for coats and equipment, and one window facing east that let in good morning light and cold evening drafts. She slept on the floor with a folded canvas and 2 wool blankets, and she was warmer than she had been in some places, as she had told him truthfully. She had spent one winter in her childhood in a room with 5 people and a stove that only worked when the wind cooperated. This was not hardship, but it was proximity. Nathan was careful about it in a way that she appreciated. He stepped over her bedroll without looking at it in the mornings. He went to bed after she was already settled and said nothing when she read by the oil lamp later than was practical. He was, she came to understand, a man who had a deep and habitual respect for other people's private space, probably because he had always had so much of it for himself. He had been alone for a long time. She could see it in the way the cabin was arranged, everything positioned for maximum efficiency for one person, everything placed where a single man would reach for it without thinking, nothing left out that was not functional. There were no decorations except for a small framed daguerreotype on the shelf beside the books, a woman and a man standing in front of a house, formal and unsmiling in the way of old photographs. She did not ask about it. Not yet. What she did ask on the third day was whether she could reorganize the supply shelf near the stove, because the way it was arranged made the flour inaccessible without moving for other things. He looked at the shelf for a long moment and then said, "Do whatever makes sense." She reorganized it. He watched her do it with an expression she was beginning to learn meant he was revising an assumption. The days fell into a rhythm faster than she would have expected. She cooked, not elaborately, but competently, and she kept the cabin in order, and she helped with the cattle work in ways that surprised him because she had grown up near horses and was not afraid of large animals. She could not yet do the heavier ranch work, but she learned quickly, and she asked useful questions, and she did not pretend to know things she did not know, which he told her was the most important quality in anyone working with cattle. "Most hands I have hired have known less than you and pretended to know more," he said one afternoon, while they were moving a section of the herd toward the winter pasture. "It is a dangerous habit around cattle." "It is a dangerous habit anywhere," she said, thinking without intending to of Sela's crane. He glanced at her sidelong from his horse. He had the beginning of something in his expression that she did not pursue. That evening she made cornbread and a beef stew from a cut she had found in the cool larder, and they sat across from each other at the small table and ate in comfortable silence, which she had discovered was comfortable rather than strained only in the last few days. There was a difference, she had decided, between silence that was empty and silence that was full, and Nathan Bailey's silences were full ones. "Tell me about the books," she said. He looked at the shelf. "What about them? You have 12 books on a shelf in a single-room cabin in Montana. I want to know why those 12. He was quiet for a moment and she thought he might deflect, but instead he said, "My mother sent them out when I first settled here. She thought I would go mad without something to read through the winters." "And did you?" "Come close," he said. "First 2 winters I was here alone." "Where is she now?" Rebecca asked. "Your mother?" "Ohio. She and my father live on a farm outside Columbus. They are well." "The daguerreotype, then." She looked at the shelf and he followed her gaze and said quietly, "That is them, taken in 1871. She understood then that there was homesickness in this man, old and well-managed but not entirely gone, and it made him more human to her in a way that she felt in her sternum. "Do you go back?" she asked. "Not since I came out here in 1878, he said. "It is a long way." "It is," she agreed. He looked at her directly then, one of those gray-eyed looks that she was learning went deeper than his words. "Why did you really come?" he said. "Not the agency version, the real version." She held his gaze. "I needed to start over somewhere. No one knew my name. That is the truest thing I can tell you." He nodded slowly. "That is a fair reason," he said. "What is your real reason for the advertisement?" She asked because it seemed only right. He looked at his hands on the table. "Frank Delacroix is my nearest neighbor, about 4 miles west. Frank told me I was becoming too separate from the world, that I had forgotten how to be with people." He paused. "I think he was right. Separate is not always bad," she said carefully. "No," he agreed, "but it can become a habit." She went back to her stew, and the lamp between them threw warm gold light across the table, and outside the October wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge above the valley, and neither of them said anything else. But the silence that filled the room afterward was the fullest kind she had ever sat inside. 2 weeks after her arrival, Nathan told her he was going to build the addition. He said it one morning over coffee in the most matter-of-fact way possible, as though it were a thing he had decided after purely practical consideration. "The cabin needs an extension. I have been meaning to do it, and this is the time to get it done before the hard frost sets in. It will give you a proper sleeping room." Rebecca looked at him over her cup. She knew, with the quiet intelligence she had always applied to people, that this was not purely practical. He had been meaning to do it for years, probably, and had not done it. Something had changed his schedule. She did not say any of this. "Can I help?" she asked. He looked momentarily startled, as though the question had not occurred to him as possible. "You would be useful hauling timber," he said after a moment. "Then I will haul timber," she said. They built the addition together over the course of 3 weeks, working in the clear cold days of late October and early November before the serious snow arrived. Nathan's neighbor Frank Delacroix came to help for 2 days and brought his son Eli, who was 17 and worked silently and efficiently, and could not stop sneaking curious looks at Rebecca, which Frank noticed and addressed with a firm word that made Rebecca smile. Frank Delacroix was a broad, sun-darkened French-Canadian man of about 50 who had been in the valley longer than Nathan and treated him with the brisk affection of an older brother. He shook Rebecca's hand on the first morning and said, in his accented English, "You are the one from Kansas. Good." He needed somebody with a backbone. The last one cried and went home in 4 hours. There was another one. Rebecca asked Nathan later when Frank was out of earshot. "The agency sent someone in 1880, Nathan said, without elaborating. He was fitting a log into the frame of the new wall with focused precision. And," she prompted. She had expected something different, he said. "So did I," said Rebecca. He looked at her. And yet, she agreed, and went back to her end of the timber. She thought about that exchange that night on her floor blankets, the way a small sentence could carry so much weight when 2 people were paying attention to each other. And yet, 2 words that contained everything that had not yet been said between them, all the space they were both very carefully not closing too fast. The addition went up clean, and solid. Nathan Bailey built things the way he did everything else, with quiet competence and no wasted motion. It was a room 12 feet by 10, with a small window facing south for light and a door cut into the cabin wall so she could access both spaces without going outside. He put a sleeping cot in it, a proper one with a rope frame and a straw mattress that he had ordered from Millhaven, and a small chest for her belongings, and a peg rail on the wall. The morning she moved her bedroll and satchel into that room, she stood in the doorway looking at the space he had made for her and felt something that was not yet love but was in the same country as it. Something that said, "This person sees you and is making room." She said, "Thank you, Nathan." He was standing behind her in the cabin doorway and she heard him take a breath and let it go. "It was practical," he said. "Yes," she said, "it was." They both knew it was not only practical. They both left that knowing where it was, untouched and safe, and went back to the work of the day. November arrived hard and fast that year, which old Frank had predicted and Nathan had prepared for. The temperature dropped to levels that Rebecca had not experienced. Kansas winters were cold, but Montana winters were something categorically different. A cold that had intention and weight, that pushed against walls and found every gap. The snowfall in the valley was 3 feet in the first week of November, and it did not melt. She learned winter cattle work in those weeks, which was its own education. The herd had to be moved to the lower sheltered pasture, and feed had to be managed carefully because the supply through to spring had to be rationed, and any animal showing signs of illness had to be addressed immediately before it spread. Nathan had prepared well and his herd was healthy, but the work of maintaining that through a Montana winter required daily attention. Rebecca threw herself into it without reservation. She was not delicate, she had never been delicate, and she found in the physical work of the ranch a kind of satisfaction she had not felt since she stopped being a girl and started being a person responsible for surviving. There was something clarifying about work that had immediate, visible consequences. The cattle were fed or they were not. The water trough was broken and ice-blocked or it was clear. The fence held or it did not. She liked clarity. She had had too much ambiguity in her recent history. Nathan noticed. He noticed in the way he communicated, which was not with words but with the gradual expansion of what he trusted her to handle alone. By the third week of November, she was doing the morning water check and the feed distribution without him, and he was using that time to work on the far pasture fencing. And when she came back to the cabin at midday to start the fire and put lunch together, she would find that he had already brought in the wood and banked the stove to keep the pipes from freezing. They were taking care of each other's work without discussing it, and both of them noticed this and said nothing. On a cold Thursday in late November, Rebecca was returning from the cattle pasture when she found a man on a horse at the edge of the property line, sitting still and watching the cabin with an attention that made her pause. She approached slowly. The man was not Nathan and was not Frank Delacroix, and he was not anyone she had seen in the 4 miles ride into Millhaven. He was watching the cabin with a focused intensity that raised the hair on her arms. She rode to within calling distance and said clearly, "Can I help you?" The man turned his horse and looked at her. He was perhaps 40, weathered face, heavy coat, a rifle in the saddle scabbard that was visible but not drawn. He looked at her with a flat, assessing gaze and then said, "That Bailey's place." "It is," she said. "Where is he?" "Working," she said. "What is your business?" The man looked at her for a moment longer with that flat gaze and then said, "He will know when I come back," and turned his horse and rode toward the Millhaven road at an unhurried pace. Rebecca rode back to find Nathan at the far pasture and told him what she had seen, describing the man precisely. Nathan's face went through a change she had not seen on it before, controlled, deliberate, but underneath it a tension that was not quite fear and not quite anger but something cold that was related to both. "Tall. Brown horse with a white marking on the left hindquarter," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked out toward the road for a moment. "That is possibly Dalton Marsh," he said. "Who is Dalton Marsh?" she asked. He told her the story with the same directness he brought to everything, but she could hear in it the careful arrangement of a man who had thought about this problem for a long time. Dalton Marsh was a man who had worked for Nathan briefly in 1880 and had been let go after it was discovered he had been selling fence wire from the property. Not a huge theft, but a deliberate one, and a violation of trust that Nathan had taken seriously. Marsh had left without incident but had made a comment to Frank Delacroix at the time that suggested he felt the dismissal was unjust. "Frank thinks he is just talk," Nathan said, "but he has come around the property twice in the last year. I have not been able to establish what he wants." "Have you spoken to the sheriff in Millhaven?" Rebecca asked. "Twice," he said. "Without an actual incident there is nothing the sheriff can do, and the sheriff in Millhaven is an adequate man but not a particularly energetic one." Rebecca sat with this for a moment. "What does Marsh want?" "I am not certain," Nathan said. "This property is worth more than it was in 1880. The valley has gotten more valuable as more people settle here. I wonder sometimes if he is looking for a claim to make." "What kind of claim?" "He worked here long enough to know the layout of the operation," Nathan said. "In 1880, the territorial courts were less organized than they are now, and there were cases where former hired hands attempted to establish claims based on implied partnership. Those claims rarely succeeded, but they created legal problems that some men used as leverage." "Leverage for what?" she said, though she already suspected. "For a buyout, pay them to go away," Nathan said. "And you will not do that." "No," he said simply, and finally she nodded. The situation had a shape she recognized, a hidden threat, a dark past connection, a man with a grievance real or manufactured using it as a tool. She had seen something similar with Sela's crane, though on a different scale and with different stakes, and she understood the particular danger of a man who felt entitled to something he was not going to receive. "Then we need to be careful," she said. "And you should write to the land office in Missoula and establish clearly on paper that the property title is clean and undisputed, before he makes any move." Nathan looked at her. "That is a good thought," he said. "I have been around people who use paperwork as weapons," she said. "The best defense is better paperwork." A corner of his mouth moved, Not quite a smile, but close. "I will write to Missoula this week." The Dalton Marsh situation remained a background tension through December, not erupting but not resolving either. Marsh was seen twice more near the property boundary, and once in Millhaven talking to a man known to be a territorial claims broker, which was not illegal but was suggestive. Nathan sent his letter to the land office and received confirmation within 3 weeks that his title was fully registered and uncontested. He shared this with the Millhaven sheriff, who said he would have a word with Marsh about the boundary watching. It did not eliminate the threat entirely, but it reduced it to a manageable concern, and that was the best that could be done for now. In the meanwhile, December brought its own gifts. The valley under snow was extraordinary. Rebecca had not expected beauty on this scale. The way the white covered everything, and the mountains rose above the valley in a kind of severe and overwhelming grandeur that made her feel very small and very awake. She had grown up with prairie landscapes that went on until they simply stopped at the sky. And the mountains were something different, something that insisted on your attention in a way that prairie never did. She told Nathan this one evening when they were sitting at the table after supper, the lamp between them, snow tapping softly at the window. She said, "I have never lived anywhere with mountains before. I keep looking up." He looked at her with an expression that had been becoming more frequent in the last few weeks, an openness that was replacing the careful neutral face he had worn in the first days. "You get used to them," he said. "I do not think I want to get used to them," she said. He smiled then, a real one, the first full smile she had seen on him, and it changed his face entirely, broke open the reserved surface of it and showed her something warm and unguarded underneath. And Rebecca Pritchard felt the thing in her chest that had been carefully contained since approximately the 3rd day simply come loose. She looked back at her coffee cup. "You should smile more," she said, before she could decide whether to say it or not. He was quiet for a moment and she thought she had overstepped, but then he said, "I am out of practice." "I know the feeling," she said. The week before Christmas, Frank Delacroix came over with his wife Marguerite, a small, decisive woman of Quebecois origin who assessed Rebecca in about 90 seconds, and then declared her excellent company, and began talking to her, as though they had known each other for years. Marguerite brought a fruit cake she had made from dried apples, and a bottle of whiskey that she pressed on Nathan with instructions not to drink it alone. They spent the evening around the table in the cabin, and Marguerite told stories about the early valley years when there was no town and the nearest store was a full day's ride. And Frank told the story of how he had once ridden into a blizzard to find a stray cow and gotten so turned around that he had walked in circles for 6 hours and ended up 200 yards from his own barn. Nathan told a story about his first winter, 1878, when he had been 27, and had come out here from Ohio with 2 horses and a wagon full of equipment, and approximately no realistic understanding of what he was walking into. Rebecca listened to all of it and laughed where it was funny and asked questions where it was interesting, and she watched Nathan talk with people he trusted, and felt she was seeing the fuller version of him for the first time. A man who was drier and funnier than he appeared at first, who listened carefully and remembered what people told him, who had a warmth that he kept banked low but that came up clearly in the company of people he had chosen. She liked him. She acknowledged to herself that night in her little room with the wall between them. She liked him genuinely and well, and that was both simpler and more complicated than anything else that had happened since she arrived. On Christmas morning she gave him a gift she had made secretly over 3 evenings, a pair of gloves she had knitted from wool she had purchased in Millhaven on their last supply run, in a pattern she knew from her mother. She was not an expert knitter, but she was competent, and the gloves were solid and warm, and she had cut them to the right size by tracing his hand on paper one evening while he slept. He held them for a long moment. Then he said, "You traced my hand while I was sleeping." "You have large hands," she said. "I needed an accurate measurement." He laughed. Not the small almost smile she had come to collect like currency, but an actual laugh, startled and genuine, and she felt it in every part of her. He gave her the book of poetry he had ordered from Missoula 3 weeks earlier, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. It was Tennyson. She held it with both hands and something in her throat tightened. "You ordered this for me," she said. "I noticed you had read everything on the shelf twice," he said. She looked up at him. He was standing close enough that she could see the texture of his wool shirt, could see the way the morning light from the east window fell across the strong line of his jaw, and she thought, "I am in real trouble here in the very best way, and I am not even slightly sorry." "Thank you, Nathan," she said. "Merry Christmas, Rebecca," he said, and his voice had dropped to a quieter register, and neither of them moved, and it was the longest and most significant moment they had shared yet, standing in that small cabin with the snow outside and the stove warming the air between them, until his horse kicked the barn wall and they both came back to themselves and stepped apart. The new year came in, 1883, cold and glittering. January in the Bitterroot was the hardest month. The temperature dropped lower than Rebecca had thought temperature could go, and the work with the cattle became an exercise in endurance and vigilance. 2 of the herd fell ill with a respiratory infection that required twice daily treatment and careful isolation, and Nathan worked around the clock for a week until the animals improved, and Rebecca worked alongside him without being asked. On the 4th night of that week she brought coffee out to the barn at 2 in the morning, because she had woken to hear him go out and knew he would not have thought to take anything with him, and she found him sitting in the hay beside the sick animals with his coat collar up and his eyes red from cold and sleeplessness, and when she pressed the cup into his hands his fingers closed around it and he said quietly, "You did not have to come out. Drink your coffee," she said, and sat down in the hay beside him. They sat together in the lamplit barn with the 2 sick cattle and the sound of the other animals shifting in their stalls and the cold pressing in at the walls, and after a while his shoulder came to rest against hers, a settling and ease, and she did not move away and neither did he. It was the first time they had touched that meant something. He said eventually, "This is not what you expected when you answered that letter." "No," she agreed, "but it is better." He turned his head and looked at her in the lantern light, and his expression was open in a way she had not seen in even the warmest moments of Christmas, an openness that was unguarded and slightly vulnerable, and she thought that this was perhaps the real Nathan Bailey, not the reserved, capable man who moved efficiently through his days, but this man in a freezing barn at 2 in the morning, tired and worried and glad to have someone beside him. "Rebecca," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am very glad you came," he said. She turned her face toward him. They were close enough that she could see the individual shadows in his gray eyes, close enough that the small breath he let out was warm against her cold cheek. She said, "So am I." He kissed her gently, once, tentative and deliberate, and she kissed him back with the same care, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into his warmth, and they sat like that in the hay until the first gray of dawn, when the sick cattle were clearly stable and they could go back inside. They did not discuss it the next morning, or the morning after that, but something had changed irreversibly, a door opening that had no handle on the outside. They moved through the days now with a new awareness of each other, not awkward, but heightened, like a note that had been added to a piece of music that changed the entire quality of the sound. He started sitting closer at the table in the evenings. She started looking for reasons to be near where he was working. They found excuses to be within arm's reach of each other, and each time it happened there was a small, bright current of awareness between them that neither of them named yet, because naming it would require a decision. The decision was accelerated by Dalton Marsh. In the 3rd week of January, Marsh returned, not hovering at the property line this time but riding directly up to the cabin door. Nathan was out at the far pasture when Marsh arrived, and Rebecca was in the cabin making bread when she heard the horse. She went to the door and opened it to find Marsh dismounting, the same flat face, the same assessing gaze, the rifle still in the scabbard. "Bailey around," he said. "He is working," Rebecca said. "I can give him a message." Marsh looked at her in a way that was not quite threatening, but was not respectful either. A slow once-over that she had learned to recognize as a test, seeing if she would flinch, seeing what she was made of. She had been tested by better men than Dalton Marsh. "Tell him I want to talk about a business proposition," Marsh said, "related to this land. He has received your proposal through the territorial claims broker in Millhaven," Rebecca said, keeping her voice even. "And his title has been confirmed by the Missoula Land Office as clean and undisputed. There is no legal basis for any claim, and any further approach of this property will be reported to the county sheriff as harassment." "I will pass that message along." Marsh stared at her. His jaw moved slightly. "You must be the woman from the agency," he said. "I am Rebecca Pritchard," she said. "Good morning." He stood there for a long moment, long enough that she felt the fear she had been suppressing very carefully in her sternum. And then he swung back onto his horse and rode away without another word. Nathan came back to find her sitting at the table with the bread dough still unfinished, and she told him exactly what had happened and what she had said. He sat very still while she talked, and then he stood up and went to the window and looked out toward the road for a moment, and when he turned back his expression was something she had not seen clearly on him before. "You told him that alone," Nathan said. "Yes," she said. "You were not afraid," he said. She looked at him honestly. "I was afraid," she said, "but I was more afraid of what he would do if he thought there was nobody here but him." Nathan came across the room to where she was sitting, and he took her face in both his large, calloused hands with the most profound gentleness she had ever felt directed at her in her life, and he said, very quietly, "Rebecca." "Nathan," she said. He kissed her, not the careful, tentative kiss from the barn, but a real one, full and warm and certain, the kind of kiss that does not ask a question but answers one. And she put her hands over his and kissed him back with everything she had been holding carefully in reserve for 3 months. When they separated, his forehead came down to rest against hers. They stayed like that for a moment, breathing, and the afternoon light came through the south-facing window and across the unfinished bread dough on the table, and outside the snow was deep and quiet, and the mountains were enormous and still. "I think," he said, against her forehead, "that I have been falling in love with you since you told me you had slept in smaller." She laughed, which surprised him, and he pulled back to look at her, and she said, "You told me the cabin was too small for two." "I was an idiot," he said. "You built an addition," she said. "I would build you a whole house," he said. "I would build you a whole town if that was what it took." She looked at him with her heart very full and said, "The addition is enough." Dalton Marsh made one more approach that winter, in February, and this time Nathan was there to meet him at the property line. What passed between them was a conversation that Nathan described afterward as brief and unambiguous, and Marsh was not seen near the property again. The county sheriff later told Nathan that Marsh had relocated to a town in Wyoming, which the sheriff delivered as simple information, and Nathan received as a conclusion. The legal threat was over. The dark past that Marsh had represented the grievance Nathan had carried for 3 years, the background anxiety that had been a steady low note in his life here, was gone, and Rebecca saw him physically lighter for it, standing a little straighter, moving through his days with less of the watchfulness she had attributed to his nature, and now understood was partly circumstance. She told him about Sela's crane in full in February. Not because she felt she had to, but because she wanted there to be nothing between them that was not known. She told him the whole story, the courtship, the careful use she had been put to without her knowledge, the inquiry, the changed look of the town afterward, the way it had felt to be suspected of something she had not done. He listened without expression, which she had learned meant he was listening very deeply. When she finished, he said, "Do you know where he is now?" "No," she said, "nor do I care. The damage he did was to my confidence in my own judgment, and I have mostly repaired that." "Your judgment is excellent," Nathan said. "The Marsh situation demonstrated that clearly." "My judgment allowed me to answer your letter," she said. He looked at her. Then I am grateful for it every day, he said. In March they sent a letter to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis informing them that the trial period had concluded satisfactorily and that they would be proceeding to formal arrangement and asking for guidance on the appropriate legal pathway. They received back a pamphlet on territorial marriage laws and a congratulatory note that was clearly a form letter but felt genuine anyway. They were married in April in Millhaven, which had a justice of the peace who had been performing weddings for the valley for 15 years and clearly found the ceremony moving every time, as he teared up slightly during the exchange of vows in a way that Frank Delacroix, standing as Nathan's witness, found very entertaining. Marguerite Delacroix stood with Rebecca and had brought flowers, early spring wildflowers from the south-facing slope, purple and yellow, tucked into a bunch and tied with cloth end. Rebecca held them in both hands and looked at Nathan, and said her vows clearly and without wavering, and Nathan looked at her and said his with the same directness he brought to everything important. And when the justice pronounced them married and Nathan kissed her in front of the Delacroix family and the justice's elderly mother who had accompanied him because she liked weddings, Rebecca felt a kind of clean, unambiguous joy that she had thought perhaps she was not capable of any more. They rode home in the afternoon light with the mountains above them and the spring mud of the road under the horses' hooves, and the valley was beginning to green at its edges after the winter, and Nathan reached over on the road and took her hand where it rested on her saddle horn and held it, and she felt the rough warmth of his fingers around hers and thought, "This is mine now, and I will keep it carefully." The spring cattle drive was Nathan's biggest since he had started the operation, and Rebecca was part of it. The contract with the Missoula beef buyer required 60 head in good condition, and they had 58 viable animals after the winter's attrition, which was too short of contract. Nathan had arranged to purchase 2 additional animals from Frank Delacroix to make up the count, and they organized the drive in the second week of May. Frank and Eli Delacroix came to help, and they hired a day hand from Millhaven named Theo, who was 19 and quietly efficient, and the 5 of them moved the herd north through the valley toward the Missoula road over 4 days. Rebecca rode dragged the dust-heavy rear position that nobody wanted without complaint, and by the end of the second day Theo had stopped treating her with careful politeness and was talking to her straight, which was how she preferred it. The drive went cleanly. The beef buyer in Missoula was a practical man who paid on time and asked no unnecessary questions, and Nathan received a bank draft that was significantly better than the previous year because beef prices had risen with the growth of eastern markets. They stayed the night in Missoula at a hotel that had hot water and real bed frames, and Rebecca looked at Nathan across a restaurant table that evening, a real restaurant, with cloth napkins and a proper menu, and felt the particular pleasure of sharing ordinary comfort with someone you love. "You are pleased," he said, watching her. "I am," she said. "The cattle are delivered and you are paid, and we are eating something that someone else cooked." "That last item carries weight," he said. "It carries a great deal of weight," she said. He smiled across the table at her. They had been married 6 weeks and he was still learning to let himself smile easily and without looking first to see if it was welcome, and she was still feeling the small bright joy of it every time he did. He ordered wine with dinner, which cost more than was strictly practical, and lifted his glass to her and said, "To a good winter and a better spring." "And everything after," she said. On the ride home through the valley, the mountains on all sides catching the late spring light, he told her things he had not told her before. About Ohio, about his family, 2 sisters and a brother, all of them settled closer to home than he had managed to be, about why he had come west in the first place. He told her that at 27 he had felt the specific restlessness of a man who could see the shape of the life that was expected of him and could not make himself want it. Not that the expected life was wrong or bad. His parents had a good marriage and a solid farm and were content people. He simply could not find in himself the desire to step into a version of someone else's contentment, however well made it was. So he had come west, because the West in 1878 still offered the possibility of building something from the beginning according to your own specifications. He had chosen the Bitterroot Valley for practical reasons: good water, defensible pasture, a growing local economy, and had spent 5 years building exactly what he had pictured. And then it was built, Rebecca said, and you were in it alone. Yes, he said simply. That is the hardest part, she said. Building something that needs to be shared. He looked at her across the horses as they rode. You understand that from your own experience. I built my small version of it in Alderton, she said. The school and the room above the store and the 2 years of something decent, and then it needed something it did not have. And then you came here, he said. And then I came here, she agreed. He reached over again. He had developed this habit, reaching for her hand when they were riding side by side, a simple gesture that still moved her every time. And she gave him her hand, and they rode like that for a mile in the spring afternoon, and the valley was green and enormous around them, and the creek that ran through the lower pasture was running high and clear with snowmelt, and above them the mountains were beginning to show their summer faces where the snow was retreating upward. And Rebecca Bailey had taken his name, and felt it sit on her like something that had been cut for her specifically, thought that she had not made a mistake, not a single one, since the moment she decided to answer his letter. Summer brought new work and new pleasures. Rebecca planted a kitchen garden behind the cabin addition, which Nathan helped her prepare by turning the soil with the draft horse, and then left entirely to her management, because he said honestly that he did not know anything about growing vegetables, and she seemed to. She grew beans and squash and root vegetables and herbs, and by late summer it was producing enough to supplement their diet meaningfully. And she preserved what she could for winter with a system of glass jars that Nathan had ordered from Missoula in a quantity that his dry goods account had clearly found notable. She wrote to her older sister Clara in Missouri, the first letter she had sent in a year. Clara had been worried. Rebecca knew that. But Rebecca had not been ready to write from Alderton after the Crane situation, had not wanted to put into words the embarrassment and the grief of it. Now she could write from a different place entirely, and she did, 4 pages on paper she had bought in Millhaven, describing the valley and the ranch and Nathan in terms that she later admitted were perhaps slightly rhapsodic. Clara wrote back within 3 weeks with a letter that made Rebecca laugh and cry in the same reading, full of the sharpness and warmth that Clara had always deployed simultaneously. Clara said she was glad Rebecca had found her bearings and that the man sounded unusual in the good way and that she expected an invitation when it was practical. Rebecca showed Nathan the letter. He read it carefully and said, "Would she come, do you think, if we asked?" "She would come," Rebecca said. "She has always wanted to see the mountains." "Then we should ask," he said. She looked at him. "You would want that." "Your family is welcome in this house," he said with a simplicity that was absolute. "What is mine is yours, and that includes the space for the people you love." She put her arms around him where he stood and held him, and he held her back with his chin on her hair, and the garden was growing outside, and the mountains were blue in the summer afternoon, and she thought, "I have been given back everything that was taken, and then more." Clara came in September, traveling by train to Missoula and then by hired coach to Millhaven, where Nathan met her with the wagon and Rebecca was sitting on the bench beside him, and Clara stepped off the coach and saw her sister's face and said, "Oh good, she is happy," in the tone of someone checking a vital item off a list. Clara was 31 and a schoolteacher herself in Missouri, unmarried by choice and entirely comfortable with that choice. And she and Nathan regarded each other at first with the careful assessment of 2 people who both love the same person and need to determine whether the other one is worthy of it. By the second day, Clara had concluded that he was, and had told Nathan directly that he had good sense and a steady character, which is rarer than it should be. And Nathan had told Rebecca privately that he liked her sister very much, because she says exactly what she thinks and wastes no time about it, which is a family trait apparently. "Is that a complaint?" Rebecca had asked. "It is the opposite of a complaint," he said. Clara stayed 2 weeks and spent half of them helping Rebecca put up vegetables for winter and the other half reading Nathan's books and having long evening conversations with him about things Rebecca cheerfully admitted she had not read. She rode out with them to the pasture and asked intelligent questions about the cattle operation and declared the mountains exactly as extraordinary as Rebecca had described. On her last night after Nathan had gone to bed, Clara sat with Rebecca at the table and said quietly, "You are safe here." "I know," Rebecca said. "Not just from want," Clara said. "From the other thing. The thing that happened in Alderton." "I know," Rebecca said again. "Does he know about it?" "All of it," Rebecca said. Clara nodded. She looked at the wall between the table and the room beyond where Nathan slept. "Good man," she said again, confirming something she had already decided. "Yes," said Rebecca. In November, Rebecca told Nathan she was carrying their child. She told him in the evening after supper with the lamp between them and the first snow of the new winter coming down outside the window. She said it plainly. She had learned from him that plainness was the most honest form of speaking, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions so private and real that she felt she was seeing something she was privileged to be allowed to see. He said nothing for a moment. Then he came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his and looked up at her with those gray eyes very full and said, "Rebecca." "Yes," she said. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very well." He pressed his forehead to her hands and stayed there for a long moment, and she felt the warmth of his breath on her fingers and heard the quality of what he was feeling in the small sound he made, controlled but not quite contained. "We will need a bigger cabin," she said, after a moment. He lifted his head and looked at her, and she could see that he was laughing and crying at the same time, which she had not seen from him before and which was extraordinary on his controlled face. "I will build whatever is needed," he said. "You always do," she said. He began the second addition that winter, planning it carefully for spring construction, a proper second bedroom and an expanded kitchen, because the baby would need space, and so would the people caring for it. He drew plans on paper at the table in the evenings, and Rebecca sat across from him and made suggestions, and he incorporated most of them without making it apparent that he was doing so, which was his particular way of collaboration. Frank Delacroix came in March and declared the plans good and promised his help for the construction, and Marguerite declared that she would be present for the birth, and there was no discussion of whether this was acceptable because Marguerite Delacroix did not ask permission for things she had decided. In May, in the room with the south-facing window that Nathan had built for her in that first October, with Marguerite present and a doctor from Millhaven who rode hard and arrived with an hour to spare, Rebecca gave birth to a boy. He was healthy and loud and had, unmistakably, Nathan's strong-boned face and Rebecca's copper hair, a combination that struck everyone in the room as perfect. Nathan was in the doorway when it was over. Marguerite had made him wait outside for most of it because she said men were more hindrance than help in these situations, but she had called him in at the moment that mattered, and he came to the bedside and looked at his son in Rebecca's arms with an expression so open and unguarded and purely wondering that Rebecca felt tears she had not expected to feel. "Look what we have made," she said. "I am looking," he said. They named him James for Nathan's father. Nathan wrote to Ohio that same week, and the answering letter from his parents arrived in 2 months, full of the precise mixture of joy and grief that distance makes inevitable. His mother wrote separately that she had cried for an hour when she read the news, which was the most Nathan said he had ever known his mother to admit to. The second edition was finished in June, and the cabin was no longer a single room, and its one additional box but a proper house with connected rooms and a kitchen that had real working counter space and storage, and a bedroom for James that had a window facing the mountains. Rebecca stood in the completed kitchen on the first morning it was finished and looked at the space around her, the shelves she had arranged, the garden visible through the window, The mountains in the distance above the valley and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that has been built deliberately, piece by piece, in full knowledge of what it was and what it was for. Nathan came in with coffee, because he had learned to do this, and set a cup beside her and stood with his own at the window looking out at the same view. "Is it enough?" he said. She looked at him. "It is more than enough," she said. "It is exactly right." He nodded, and they drank their coffee together in the morning light of that Montana summer, with James asleep in the room with the mountain view and the cattle in the green pasture, and the creek running clear below. The years settled into themselves. James grew quickly and with Nathan's particular focused quality, already by age 2 following his father around the property with intense concentration, as though he was taking notes. Nathan taught him the cattle from the very beginning, with the patience he brought to everything he cared about, crouching down to show the boy how to read an animal's condition, how to move around a herd without frightening it, how to assess the pasture grass for quality. Rebecca continued with the books she had established for the ranch, which had expanded as Nathan's operation grew. He had increased the herd to 90 animals by 1885 and had contracted with a second buyer, and the financial management of it was something that required real attention. She had also, quietly and without much discussion, begun teaching the Delacroix children on 2 mornings a week after Eli Delacroix had confessed that the nearest school in Millhaven was more than Frank was comfortable sending children to alone. She had a gift for it. She had always known this. And the sessions in the Delacroix kitchen brought back the specific joy of watching someone understand something for the first time. When the township school in Millhaven lost its teacher in 1886, and the school board sent a letter to every adult woman in the valley asking if anyone had teaching credentials, Rebecca showed Nathan the letter across the breakfast table and waited. He read it. He put it down. He looked at her. "Do you want to do it?" he said. "I think I might," she said. "Part-time, 2 days in Millhaven. I could arrange for someone to be here with James on those days." "Marguerite would take him in a heartbeat," Nathan said. "Yes," Rebecca said. "I know that. I was asking whether you wanted me here." He looked at her with the directness she had never stopped finding startling in its completeness. "I want you to be what you are," he said, "and you are a teacher. You have always been a teacher. The ranch is not a cage." She got up and went around the table and kissed him on the cheek and then on the mouth, and James, sitting in his corner of the kitchen with a carved wooden horse, looked up at them with the placid tolerance of a child accustomed to this kind of thing. "Thank you," she said. "Write to the board today," he said. She taught the Millhaven school 2 days a week through the fall and winter, riding in on the reliable horse that Nathan had designated as hers. And she was good at it in the particular way that comes from experience and genuine investment, and the school board renewed her contract enthusiastically for the following year. She became known in Millhaven, not as Nathan Bailey's wife, though she was that, but as Mrs. Bailey the teacher, which was a different kind of knowing, and both kinds together made her feel that she was fully present in the world she had chosen. The summer of 1886 brought a letter that took her a full morning to process. It was from Silas Crane, postmarked Kansas City, and she had stared at his name on the envelope for a long time before opening it. He had written to apologize. The letter was 2 pages, and it was the most carefully written document she had ever received from a person trying to manage their own guilt. She could see every constructed sentence, every calibrated word, but underneath the construction there was something real. He had been caught and convicted in Kansas City for a similar scheme in 1884 and had served 18 months in a territorial facility, and he was writing to the people he had harmed as part of what sounded like a genuine attempt to reckon with what he had done. He did not ask anything of her. He said that he recognized what he had taken from her, and that he was sorry in a way that no arrangement of words was adequate to express. She sat with the letter for a long time, and then she showed it to Nathan, who read it once and set it down and looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "Take your time," he said. She thought about it for 2 weeks and then she wrote back. 1 page. She said she had received his letter and had considered it carefully and she believed it was sincere. She said the damage he had done had not been permanent. She said this because it was true and because she wanted him to know it, not as a gift to him but as an accurate accounting. She said she did not wish him harm and that she hoped he was building something better. She did not say she forgave him because that was a word with a weight she was not ready to assign. But she said she was not carrying anger, which was also true, because Nathan Bailey and Montana and James in 5 years of real life had not left much room for anger, and she considered that a grace. She showed Nathan the letter before she sent it. He read it and handed it back and said, "That is right." "You think so," she said. "It is generous without being untrue," he said. "It is exactly what you are." She sent it and did not hear back, and that was a complete thing. A thread tied off cleanly at both ends, and she felt the relief of it even though she had not been entirely aware of the weight she was still carrying. The following spring, 1887, Rebecca told Nathan she was expecting again. He was in the barn when she told him, coming in from the morning feeding, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time. The sequence of private expressions, the wonder underneath, the specific quality of joy he reserved for things that mattered most. "Another," he said. "Another," she confirmed. He picked her up. He did this sometimes, and she had stopped being surprised by it, though it still delighted her, and held her and then put her down carefully with the particular care he had for the fact that she was carrying, and kissed her temple and said, "The bedroom addition is already there this time." "We are ahead of ourselves," she agreed. Their daughter arrived in October of 1887, and they named her Eleanor for Rebecca's mother. She had Nathan's gray eyes and an opinion about everything from approximately the first week of her life, which Marguerite Delacroix said was a sign of good character and Frank Delacroix said was a sign of a hard future for everyone around her. And Nathan said, with the quiet pride of a man who understood what he had produced, that she was exactly right. James was 6 years old and regarded his sister with the solemn consideration of a person who had been an only child and was making significant adjustments. He was, Rebecca observed, gentle with her from the beginning, not told to be, simply moved to be, and this made her feel something about who he was going to be that she held close and returned to often. The ranch by 1888 was a different proposition than the 240-acre operation Nathan had described in his letter 6 years earlier. He had acquired an adjacent parcel in 1885 when the owner relocated to California, expanding to 360 acres, and the herd had grown to 112 head. He had hired a permanent hand named Pete Rourke, a quiet and dependable man from Oregon who lived in a bunkhouse Nathan had built on the north edge of the property, and who had become, over 3 years, as much a fixture of the place as the mountains. Rebecca's teaching position had expanded too. The school board had hired a second teacher for the older students, and Rebecca had taken on the younger grades full-time in 1887, which meant 4 days a week in Millhaven, and a salary that was real money, enough to contribute meaningfully to the household account, and to the small savings fund she maintained at the bank in Millhaven under her own name, which Nathan had encouraged from the beginning because he believed, as he said, that a person should always have something that was entirely their own. She had used a portion of that savings to order more books, which now occupied 2 full shelves above the table plus a secondary shelf in the kitchen, and which Nathan read alongside her in the evenings in the particular companionable way they had developed of reading together, each with their own book, but present in the same space, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other when something struck them as worth sharing. James had been given a shelf of his own and approached books with the same methodical seriousness he brought to cattle work, reading each one fully before moving to the next, never skipping, never abandoning. Eleanor at one had strong opinions about which books were interesting to chew on and which were not. The Christmas of 1888 was the fullest the cabin-turned-proper house had ever been. Clara had come again from Missouri and brought a friend who was a fellow teacher, a quiet woman named Ruth who turned out to have opinions about everything and fit immediately into the extended household in a way that made Clara very pleased and somewhat complacent about it. Frank and Marguerite came for dinner on Christmas Day, and Eli Delacroix came with his new wife, a girl from Missoula named Hattie who was finding the valley overwhelming and beautiful in equal measure, and who Rebecca took under her arm in the specific way of a woman who had once found the same thing overwhelming and beautiful and had decided to stay. Nathan sat at the head of the long table he had built to replace the small one. He had built it in September specifically because he knew Christmas was coming and Clara was coming and there needed to be room. And he looked down the length of it at Rebecca at the other end and at the people filling the space between them. Frank's deep laugh and Marguerite's efficient French-accented directives about the food and Clara reading something aloud that she found funny and James sitting beside Pete Rourke, explaining something about cattle with complete seriousness, and Alina in her chair with an expression of someone presiding over events she finds acceptable. And Nathan Bailey, who had spent 5 years alone in a single room in the Montana mountains, deciding whether he was too separate from the world, looked at all of this, and then looked at his wife at the other end of the table. And Rebecca looked back at him across the room full of people and warmth and noise, and they held each other's gaze for a long moment that contained 6 years of everything. The October doorway and the barn in January, and the addition going up log by log and the baby names and the letters, and the way he had taken her hands in his, and the way she had pressed coffee into his in the cold. And Nathan raised his glass toward her, just slightly, a private gesture in the middle of the crowded room, and Rebecca raised hers in return, and it was the most complete conversation she had ever had without words. In the spring of 1889, Montana Territory became Montana State. The valley celebrated with a gathering in Millhaven that everyone attended. There was music from a fiddler, and a man with a trumpet and food on long tables outside the general store and speeches from the mayor, and from a state representative who had ridden in from the capital. Rebecca and Nathan stood together in the crowd with James holding Nathan's hand and Alina on Rebecca's hip, and there was something in the moment the formal crossing from territory to state, the sense of a place becoming fully itself, that Rebecca felt in a way that was personal. She had come here when it was still raw territory. She had built her life here in the time when this valley was still becoming what it would be, and now here was the becoming, official and celebrated, and she was part of it. "We were here for the becoming," she said to Nathan. He looked at her. "We were part of it," he said, "both of us." She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, Alina between them, James against his other leg, the mountains above the town enormous and clear in the spring air, and she thought that if she had been asked at 24, standing in a town that was quietly pushing her out, if she believed a life like this was possible, not a life without difficulty, not a life without dark pasts and hidden threats and frozen winters and painful letters, and the necessary courage of facing things alone. She would have said she hoped so. She would have been afraid to say yes. She would say yes now without hesitation. Nathan had hired 2 additional hands by 1890 as the operation grew, and the ranch required real coordination to run, which Rebecca had taken on formally after reorganizing the bookkeeping system in 1888 with a double entry method she had read about in an agricultural almanac. The beef contracts were now running through a broker in Missoula who handled several valley operations, and who had told Nathan that the Bailey Ranch was the best-managed small operation in the county, which Nathan had relayed to Rebecca because she was responsible for a significant portion of that management. "Small operation," Rebecca had said. "He means the size of the acreage, not the quality," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "I am working on the acreage part." He looked at her. "Are you?" There is a parcel to the east that will come available in the next year if I am reading the signs correctly, she said. Another 70 acres of good winter range. We should be positioned to make an offer. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Show me what you have looked at." She showed him the notes she had been keeping, the public land records she had requested from the county office, the financial projections she had worked out. He read everything carefully and then he said simply, "All right." "All right, you agree, or all right, you want more information," she said. "All right, I trust your judgment," he said, "and all right, let us do it." She looked at him with the warmth she had been feeling for 8 years and that had not diminished in a single day of those years and said, "We are going to need to build more fencing." "I know," he said. "I am not afraid of building things." "No," she said. "You never were." The parcel came available in 1891, and they purchased it at a price that was fair and that Nathan paid for mostly from the ranch, income with a small portion from Rebecca's savings account, which she contributed over his mild protest, and she overrode with the observation that it was both their ranch and both their names on the deed, and therefore both their capital that should be used. He could not argue with this logic, and he did not try. James was 10 that year and already riding on actual cattle work with Pete Rourke and the other hands, not playing at it but genuinely useful. And Nathan spent real time teaching him in the specific way he taught everything patiently, in layers, never pretending a thing was simpler than it was. Rebecca watched them together sometimes from the cabin door, the tall man and the small boy, both of them with the same particular focused quality, the same economy of movement, and felt a love so large it occasionally alarmed her. Eleanor at 4 was a force of nature. She had indeed developed opinions about everything and communicated them without self-consciousness. And she had also developed a gift for drawing that Rebecca had noticed and quietly fostered by providing paper and pencils, which Eleanor used to fill with pictures of horses and mountains and the people of her small world. Nathan had put one of her drawings up on the cabin wall, a picture of the 4 of them in front of the house, stylized and charming and completely accurate in some important emotional way, and it was the only decoration on the wall besides the daguerreotype of his parents. In the evenings Nathan read to them, which he had begun when James was 3, and maintained, as the children's expectations hardened into pleasurable requirement. He read well, not with theatrical performance but with the quiet expressiveness of a man who understood what he was reading, and the children arranged themselves against him on the settee he had built in 1886, James on one side and Eleanor on the other, and Rebecca watched from across the room sometimes, not reading herself, just watching, feeling the specific texture of this life that was hers. She sometimes thought about the woman she had been in Alderton, the schoolteacher with her careful small life and her trust in a man who did not deserve it, and she felt for that woman a compassion that was not pity. That woman had been doing the best she could with what she had, and what she had eventually brought her to a doorway in Montana with a worn satchel and no money and the particular stubbornness that had saved her. She was glad for the stubbornness. She was glad she had said she had slept in smaller. She was glad she had not let herself be turned away by a man who was trying to talk himself out of needing her, who had built her a room before he even admitted why. She told him this one night in 1892, 15 years old by now as a memory, though it felt both longer and shorter. They were lying in the bed of the room that had started as an addition and was now simply their room, in the house that had grown around them over 10 years into something real and spacious and theirs. And it was late and dark, and the children were sleeping, and she said, "Do you remember saying it was too small?" He was still for a moment, and then she heard the smile in his voice when he said, "I remember. You were trying to send me away," she said. "I was," he agreed. "I was frightened." "Of what?" she said. "Not me specifically." "Of being wrong," he said. "About whether I could be," he paused, "whether someone could come here and find it enough, and then be disappointed when she realized it was not. And then I said I had slept in smaller," she said, And then you said that, he said, and I stopped worrying about the size of the cabin. She turned toward him in the dark. Nathan. Yes. You built me an addition. I built you an addition, he said. And then a bedroom and a kitchen and a second bedroom and a better table and a settee and a proper front porch, she said. I am a methodical person, he said. She laughed, quietly so as not to wake the children, and he pulled her close in the dark room of their house in Montana, with the mountains outside and the cattle in the winter pasture and their children sleeping, and the books on all the shelves and the daguerreotype of his parents beside their wedding photograph on the bedroom shelf. And she thought, I came here with nothing but my own stubbornness, and he built everything around it. She thought, this is what a life is supposed to feel like when it is being lived by the right people in the right place. She thought, I am home. The spring of 1893 was the most beautiful Rebecca could remember in the valley, which she told Nathan was probably because she was watching it now with 11 years of reference points. And he said it was objectively the most beautiful spring in the Bitterroot in his 16 years there. And she said she was glad her subjective experience was supported by objective data. He told her in April that Frank Delacroix had confided to him that he and Marguerite were considering retiring to Missoula in the next year, to be near their son Eli and his family, and that Frank had asked Nathan privately whether he would be interested in the Delacroix land when the time came. Rebecca sat with this information. What did you tell him? She said. That I would need to discuss it with you, Nathan said. She looked at him. 10 years earlier, this would have been a different kind of statement, a courtesy, a performance of consultation. Now it was simply true. He would not make this decision without her because it was not a decision that belonged only to him. The ranch was hers as fully as it was his in law now and in practice always. Can we afford it? She said. Tight, he said. But yes, I believe so. The two properties together would give us first-rate winter range all the way down the valley, she said. Yes, he said. We would need more hands, she said. Yes, he said. And we would lose Frank and Marguerite, she said, which was the heaviest part, and she could see that Nathan felt it the same way. Yes, he said quietly. Tell him yes, she said. But tell him we want them to come back for every Christmas. Nathan smiled slowly. I suspect Marguerite will not need an invitation. No, Rebecca agreed, but make it official. Frank and Marguerite Delacroix moved to Missoula in the fall of 1893, and the valley was different without them, smaller in some important way, quieter in the specific register of Frank's laugh and Marguerite's decisive voice. Nathan and Rebecca took on the adjacent land in a sale that was fair and handled with the care of people who had been genuine neighbors, and the Bailey Ranch became, on paper, one of the larger operations in the county. Marguerite came back for Christmas as predicted, bringing Frank and Eli and Hattie and 3 grandchildren, and the long table that Nathan had built was still not quite large enough, and he said he would extend it in the spring, and Rebecca said, if he extended it one more time, they would need to add another room to the house, and he said he was not afraid of adding another room to the house. James was 12 that Christmas and had shot up to nearly Nathan's height already, which startled Rebecca sometimes. The speed of it, the way a child becomes a person in front of you so quickly you are always slightly behind. Eleanor was 6 and had started school in Millhaven, where Rebecca no longer taught because she had stopped taking the position in 1891, when the ranch required too much of her time, but where Eleanor attended with the same concentrated seriousness she brought to her drawing and her opinions. Rebecca had found, stepping away from teaching, that she had not lost that part of herself. It had become integrated into the life she lived, into the way she talked with her children, and with James's young friends who sometimes came around, and with the ranch hands, and with anyone who came to the valley and needed information. She taught as a way of being in the world rather than as a formal occupation, and this suited her very well. Nathan, at 42, was the same and different, the same essential man who had stood in that cabin doorway in 1882 with his jaw set and his gray eyes direct, but with the fullness of a decade of chosen life visible in him. He was easier in himself. The watchfulness that she now understood had been partly loneliness and partly the background vigilance of a man waiting for something to go wrong, that had largely gone. Not all the way. He was constitutionally a careful person, and that was not a flaw. But the specific tension of a man who does not trust good things to last had eased, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who has proven over years that the good thing holds. She saw it most clearly in moments when he did not know she was watching, when he was working with James on something and explaining with full patience, or when he was reading to Alina on the settee, and the child fell asleep against him, and he kept reading anyway in a voice barely above a whisper, or when he came in from a long day at the far pasture, and she handed him coffee, and his hand covered hers around the cup for a moment in the way he had always done, unthinking and warm. In December of 1894, a letter arrived from Nathan's mother in Ohio. His father had died in November. A quiet death, his mother wrote, a heart that had finally run down after 81 years of good work. He had not suffered. He had been at home in his own bed with his wife and his daughters and his son who lived nearby, and he had died as he had lived without drama and without complaint. Nathan read the letter at the table and sat quietly for a long time, and Rebecca sat across from him and said nothing, which was what he needed. When he set the letter down, his face was composed, but his eyes were red. "I did not go back enough," he said. "No," she said. "But you wrote to him, and he knew you, and he knew this." She gestured at the room around them, the house, the life. "He was proud of you." "My mother says he talked about the ranch all the time," Nathan said. To the neighbors, to anyone who came by, he would describe it as though he had seen it himself. "He had seen it," Rebecca said, "through your letters." Nathan looked at her across the table. "I would like to go," he said, "for a few weeks to be with my mother." "Of course," she said immediately. "You and the children, the ranch will be fine," she said. "Pete Rourke has been here 12 years. We will all be fine." "I do not like leaving you," he said. "I know," she said. "Go be with your mother. She needs you." He went to Ohio in January of 1895 and was gone for 6 weeks, the longest they had been separated since she arrived at his door. And Rebecca ran the ranch and the house, and managed James and Alina, and wrote to Nathan every 3 days, and received letters back in the same rhythm. Letters that were warm and specific, and that told her about the Ohio farm and his mother and his sisters, and the cold Ohio winter that he said was nothing like Montana cold. His last letter before he came home said, "I have been sitting in the house where I grew up and thinking about the life I chose instead, and I have not one moment of doubt about it. I will be home in 10 days. Do not leave a lamp out for me. You need your sleep. But know that I will be able to see the mountains from 20 miles away, and I will know I am home before I am anywhere near the door." She left the lamp out anyway. He came through the door on a February afternoon when the snow was deep, and the mountains were clear and sharp above the valley. And James was in the barn with Pete Rourke, and Alina was at the table drawing, and Rebecca was in the kitchen. And she heard the horse, and then the door, and then his boots on the floor, and she came out of the kitchen and stopped. He stood in the doorway, her doorway, their doorway, the expanded and rebuilt doorway of the house that had started as a single room, with snow on his coat and his bag in his hand and his gray eyes on her. And she crossed the room, and he dropped the bag and put his arms around her. And she held him back with both arms and her face against his neck. And Alina looked up from her drawing and said, "Papa is home," with the satisfaction of a person whose world has been correctly reassembled. "Papa is home," Rebecca agreed into his shoulder. He held her for a long moment, and then she felt him exhale the last of whatever he had been carrying, the grief and the distance and the complicated feelings of a man who has chosen a life far from his origins and knows both the cost and the rightness of it. Exhale it into the warm air of the house, let it go. She stepped back and looked at him. He looked at her, 12 years of it between them in that look. "The lamp was on," he said. "It was cold," she said. "I was not being sentimental." "No," he said, beginning to smile. "Of course not." Alina came off her chair and attached herself to his leg, and James came thundering in from the barn 2 minutes later, and the house was full again with all its right people, and Rebecca stood in the middle of it and felt the particular grace of a life that has been built against the current of fear and dark history, and the specific human tendency to expect things to fall apart. She had chosen this, not blindly, not out of desperation, but with the same clear-eyed practicality she had always brought to the important decisions, the same quality that had made her answer that terse, unromantic letter from a man in Montana who had said he needed a partner and not an ornament, and had meant every word of it. She had chosen well. The years continued to be generous. James grew into himself with the steady assurance of someone who knows what he is and what he is for, and at 16 he was working the ranch as a full partner in the practical sense, not legally yet, but in every way that mattered. He had his father's way with cattle and his mother's way with books, and a humor that was entirely his own, dry and affectionate. And he made both his parents laugh with a frequency that never stopped delighting Nathan, because he had been, before all this, a man who laughed rarely. Alina drew everything and remembered everything, and had by 14 produced a body of drawings that documented the ranch and the valley, and the people in it with an accuracy and a tenderness that a visiting painter from Missoula, passing through Millhaven in 1897, declared was genuine talent that needed proper cultivation. Rebecca had looked at Nathan after that visit and said, Missoula or further, and Nathan had said, however far she needs to go. The baby that arrived in 1897 was a surprise in the good way. Rebecca was 39 and had assumed that particular season of her life was concluded, and she was wrong. And when she told Nathan she was carrying again, he sat in the kitchen chair and looked at her with an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that she started laughing, and he started laughing. And they sat in the kitchen laughing together, until Alina came in and looked at them with the resigned tolerance of a child, who has learned that adults are occasionally inexplicable. They named the boy Thomas, and he arrived safely in the fall and was immediately and completely adored by James, who was 16 and took the role of older brother with profound seriousness, and by Alina, who drew portraits of him approximately daily, and by Pete Rourke, who said he was the finest-looking baby he had seen in all his years in Montana, and by Nathan, who held him in the barn in January and sat in the hay with him against his chest, exactly the way he had sat with Rebecca in that same barn in 1883, only 14 years and 2 children, and a full life later. Thomas turned out to be the sunniest of all of them, a child who was happy with a thoroughness that seemed constitutional, who greeted everything the world offered him with the cheerful expectation that it was going to be interesting. He was a counterweight to Alina's intensity and to James's seriousness, and to Nathan's reserve, and he rolled through all of it like warm weather, and the house was the better for him. By 1900, the century turned with all the significance that a number with that many zeros carries, and the Bitterroot Valley was a different place than it had been in 1882. More roads, more people, a proper school building in Millhaven with 3 teachers, a bank and a doctor's office and a telegraph station. Montana had been a state for 11 years, and the signs of it were everywhere. The frontier, in the old raw sense, had moved further west and north, and what was left behind was a settled country still wild at its edges, but domesticated at its center. Rebecca Bailey, standing on the front porch of the house on a January morning of the new century, with Thomas on her hip and Nathan's arm around her shoulders, and the mountains above the valley unchanged and enormous and unchanged, felt the weight of 18 years in this place not heavy, but solid, the way a good structure has weight. She had arrived here with nothing but a satchel and her stubborn refusal to be undone, and she had been given everything. Not given, she corrected herself, because she had never been a woman who mistook what she had worked for as something simply received. She had built it, alongside the man beside her who had said a room was too small and then built a larger one and then kept building, who had met her stubbornness with his own quieter version of it, who had been afraid and had stayed, who had been alone and had learned again how to be with someone, who had sat beside her in frozen barns and at long dinner tables and across 1,000 quiet evenings and had said, in all the ways that matter, "I am glad you came." She turned her face up toward him and he looked down at her, and behind them through the windows of the house they could hear Thomas making the cheerful sounds of a 3-year-old discovering things, and somewhere outside James was working with Pete Rourke, and Alina was at her drawing table in her room, and the mountains were where they had always been, enormous and permanent and beautiful. "Nathan," she said. "Rebecca," he said. "Good life," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with all the gray-eyed directness she had never stopped finding startling, and then he said, "The best one I can imagine." He kissed her on the temple, and she leaned into the warmth of him on the front porch of a house that had started as a single room in a valley in Montana, and the January light was clean and cold, and the snow on the mountains was white against the blue sky, and the cattle were in the winter pasture, and the creek was running under ice, and the life they had made together was solid and real and entirely, completely theirs. She thought of the doorway in October of 1882, the door cracked against the wall, the wind at her back, the worn satchel in her hand, and a man with a granite jaw and storm-gray eyes saying the cabin was too small for two. And she had said she had slept in smaller. And he had let her in, and he had built an addition, and then kept building, room by room and year by year, the way a man builds when he has finally found what he was building toward. She put her head on his shoulder and watched the morning come clear and cold over the valley, and she thought, I would do all of it again, every mile of it, every cold floor and frozen morning and letter written and letter received, every fear faced and every dark corner walked through to get to this light. All of it exactly as it was, to arrive here,